The Bordeaux was expensive, a 2015 vintage that Marcus Chen had spent $300 on specifically for this dinner. Red wine, dark as blood, arced through the air in slow motion as he deliberately tilted the bottle over his wife's head. Elena watched it coming. 6 months pregnant, she sat frozen at the head of the mahogany dining table in his parents' Bel Air mansion, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly as cold liquid soaked through her cream-colored maternity dress. The wine spread across the silk like a wound, staining everything it touched. "That's what I think of your opinion," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent dining room. Behind him, his mother Diane laughed, a sharp, delighted sound that cut through Elena like glass. His father Robert raised his wine glass in a mock toast, his expression one of satisfied approval. Elena's younger sister Sophia gasped from across the table, half rising from her chair before their mother Patricia grabbed her wrist and pulled her back down. "Don't make a scene," Patricia's grip said. "Don't make this worse than it already is." The wine dripped from Elena's dark hair onto her shoulders, soaking into the neckline of her dress. She could feel it trickling down her back, cold and sticky against her skin. Her hands trembled where they rested on her pregnant belly, feeling the baby kick as if sensing her mother's distress. This had started, like so many fights in the past year, with a simple disagreement. Marcus had been explaining to the gathered families, the Chens and the Rodriguezes, brought together for what was supposed to be a celebration of the upcoming baby, his plans for expanding his commercial real estate development company. He'd acquired 3 properties in downtown Los Angeles, and he was detailing, with obvious pride, how he planned to demolish the existing structures and replace them with luxury condos. "What about the current tenants?" Elena had asked quietly. "Those buildings have rent-controlled apartments. Families have lived there for decades." The question had been innocent, genuine curiosity about how he planned to handle the displacement. But Marcus had frozen mid-sentence, his jaw tightening in that way Elena had learned to recognize as dangerous. "The current tenants," he'd said slowly, his voice dropping to that cold, controlled tone that was somehow worse than yelling, "are not your concern. Business decisions are not your concern. Making money to support you and that baby is not your concern. I was just asking, you were questioning my judgment in front of our families." Marcus had stood up then, his 6-foot frame towering over the seated guests. At 34, he'd cultivated an image of power and success, the self-made man who'd built Chen Development from nothing into a $40 million enterprise. "You were undermining me in my own parents' home." Elena had looked around the table, searching for support. Her father Javier had his eyes fixed on his plate, his weathered hands gripping his fork like a lifeline. Her mother Patricia wore the same carefully neutral expression she'd perfected over 30 years of marriage to a man who'd never quite forgiven her for not being the wealthy bride his parents had wanted for him. Sophia, at 23, looked terrified, her dark eyes wide and filling with tears. The Chen family, by contrast, had watched the exchange with obvious interest. Diane Chen, Marcus's mother, had been waiting for this moment all evening. She'd made several pointed comments throughout dinner about Elena's weight gain, about her refusal to find out the baby's gender, about her decision to keep working as a cultural liaison at the Museum of Latin American Art despite being 6 months pregnant. "In my day," Diane had said, her Beijing accent lending weight to her words, wives focused on supporting their husbands. They didn't waste time on little jobs that paid nothing. Elena's position at the museum paid $45,000 a year, enough to maintain her independence, to keep her own bank account, to remember she was more than just Marcus Chen's wife. But to the Chen family, who measured worth in millions and social connections, her salary was laughable. "Marcus," Robert Chen had interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "perhaps Elena needs to be reminded of her place." That's when Marcus had reached for the wine bottle. Now Elena sat there, drenched in $300 Bordeaux, feeling the eyes of 12 people watching her humiliation. The dining room was silent except for the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantel and the barely audible sound of wine dripping from her hair onto the imported Italian tile floor. "Clean yourself up," Marcus said dismissively, already turning back to his seat. "You're embarrassing everyone." Elena stood slowly, her movements careful despite the trembling in her legs. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she pressed her hand against the spot, feeling the small foot pushing against her palm through layers of skin and muscle. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice surprisingly steady. She could feel Sophia's anguished stare boring into her back as she walked toward the powder room, her wine-soaked dress clinging to her body, leaving a trail of dark drops across Diane Chen's pristine floors. In the powder room, all marble and gold fixtures and fresh roses that cost more than Elena's monthly car payment, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Wine matted her shoulder-length black hair against her skull. Her olive skin looked pale against the dark stains spreading across her dress. But it was her eyes that caught her attention. They looked different somehow. Harder. Clearer. For 3 years, she'd been Marcus Chen's wife. For 3 years, she'd absorbed his criticism, his corrections, his endless lectures about how she needed to present herself better, speak more carefully, understand that everything she did reflected on him and his business reputation. For 3 years, she'd made herself smaller, quieter, more acceptable to the Chen family and their circle of wealthy friends and business associates. She'd done it because she'd loved him once. Because the man who'd courted her with flowers and poetry and promises had seemed so different from the cold, controlling person he'd become. She'd done it because her parents, immigrants who'd worked brutal hours to give their daughters opportunities they'd never had been so proud when she'd married into wealth and stability. But standing there, watching wine drip from her hair into the pristine sink, Elena felt something shift deep in her chest. Something that had been bending for 3 years finally straightened. Her phone buzzed in her small clutch purse. She pulled it out with shaking fingers, expecting another text from Sophia asking if she was okay. Instead, it was from a number she hadn't called in 4 years. Area code 212. New York. The preview of the message made her catch her breath. "Ms. Vasquez, this is Robert Morrison from Morrison & Associates. Regarding your grandmother's estate, urgent matter requiring immediate." Elena's grandmother. Abuela Cristina. The woman who'd died 4 years ago, 3 months before Elena's wedding to Marcus. The funeral had been small, held in a Catholic church in Queens where Cristina had lived for 40 years after leaving Colombia. Marcus had complained the entire time about the neighborhood, about the length of the service, about having to take 3 days away from work for someone he'd only met twice. Elena had been Cristina's only granddaughter, the child of her youngest daughter. They'd been close when Elena was growing up, before college, before law school, before she'd met Marcus at a networking event and been swept into a world of country clubs and charity galas and the exhausting performance of being the right kind of wife for an ambitious man. But Cristina had died with barely any possessions, a rent-controlled apartment, some furniture, a small savings account that had gone toward funeral expenses. There'd been no estate to speak of. No inheritance to discuss. Just memories of a fierce, proud woman who'd worked as a seamstress and sent money back to family in Bogota and never, not once, made her granddaughter feel like she wasn't enough. Elena opened the full message. "Ms. Elena Vasquez, this is Robert Morrison from Morrison & Associates, estate attorneys in New York. We've been attempting to contact you regarding the estate of Cristina Maria Vasquez, deceased. The 4-year waiting period has concluded, and we must discuss the distribution of assets immediately. The matter is time-sensitive and involves substantial holdings requiring your signature and attention. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience. This concerns an inheritance of significant value that has been held in trust pending your contact." Elena read it 3 times. Significant value. Substantial holdings. 4-year waiting period. Her grandmother had been a seamstress. She'd lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. She'd taken the subway everywhere and bought day-old bread from the bodega and sent every spare dollar back to Colombia. Hadn't she? Elena's hands had stopped shaking. The wine in her hair suddenly felt less like humiliation and more like a baptism. Something was ending tonight. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her daughter kicked against her ribs, in the sudden clarity of her own reflection staring back at her from the gold-framed mirror. She typed a response, "I'll call tomorrow morning. This is my cell number." The reply came within seconds, "Thank you, Ms. Vasquez." I'll be waiting for your call. What we have to discuss will change your life. Elena slipped the phone back into her purse and took a deep breath. Through the powder room door, she could hear the dinner conversation resuming. Diane's laugh. Robert's booming voice explaining something about market trends. Marcus's lower tones, probably complaining about his embarrassing wife who couldn't keep her opinions to herself. Let them talk. Let them laugh. Let them think they'd won. Elena pulled paper towels from the sterling silver dispenser and began carefully blotting wine from her hair and dress. The stains wouldn't come out, the dress was ruined, but she could make herself presentable enough to get through the rest of this dinner. Presentable enough to sit through dessert and coffee and the endless social performance that her marriage had become. Because tomorrow, she would call New York. Tomorrow, she would find out what her grandmother had left her. Tomorrow, she would start asking questions about the woman she'd thought she'd known, about the life Christina had lived before Queens, before America, before she'd become just another elderly immigrant woman invisible to people like the Chens. Tonight, she would endure. But Elena Vasquez-Chen was done being small. She dried her hands on the expensive monogram towels, smoothed down her ruined dress, and walked back to the dining room with her head high. Sophia's eyes filled with tears when she saw her. Javier's jaw tightened. Patricia looked away, unable to meet her daughter's gaze. Marcus didn't even glance up from his conversation with his father about property values and investment opportunities. The wine bottle sat on the table, still half full, the cork lying beside it like a casualty. Elena took her seat at the table, feeling the wet fabric cling uncomfortably to her back. Diane wrinkled her nose at the smell of wine, but didn't say anything. The servers, probably relieved the drama had passed, began clearing plates for the next course. Elena, Patricia said quietly, reaching across the table to touch her daughter's hand. Maybe you should. I'm fine, Mama, Elena interrupted gently. And she meant it. For the first time in 3 years, despite the wine in her hair and the humiliation burning in her chest and her husband's contempt radiating from across the table, Elena was fine. Because tomorrow, everything was going to change. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling her daughter's strong, steady kicks. Whatever inheritance her grandmother had left, whether it was $5,000 or $500,000, it was more than the money. It was a lifeline. It was a reminder that she came from women who survived. Women who built lives out of nothing. Women who never, ever, let anyone pour wine on their heads without consequence. Marcus was still talking, his voice animated as he described his vision for the downtown properties. We'll gut the interiors, completely modernize everything. These buildings are from the 70s, they're barely habitable. We'll triple the property values. What about the people who live there now? Sophia asked, her young voice shaking slightly but determined. She'd always been braver than Elena, less willing to accept injustice even when it was easier. Marcus's expression darkened. The people who live there now are paying below market rents in buildings that are falling apart. They'll be relocated. Relocated where? Sophia pressed. Those neighborhoods are already gentrifying. Where do families on fixed incomes go when you price them out? That, Marcus said coldly, is not my problem. I'm a developer, not a social worker. Elena watched him as he spoke, really looked at him for the first time in months. When had he become this person? Or had he always been this way, and she'd been too dazzled by his attention, too flattered that someone successful and confident wanted her, to see the cruelty underneath? They'd met at a young professionals networking event when Elena was finishing her master's degree in cultural studies. Marcus had seemed sophisticated, worldly, different from the struggling grad students she'd been surrounded by. He'd taken her to expensive restaurants, bought her thoughtful gifts, listened, or seemed to listen, when she talked about her work, her hopes of working in museums to help preserve and share Latino cultural heritage. That's so noble, he'd said in those early days. I love how passionate you are. Now he called her job a waste of time. Now he wanted her to quit, to stay home, to be available for his business dinners and social obligations. Now her passion was an embarrassment, a sign that she didn't understand what really mattered. The pregnancy had made it worse. Marcus had been enthusiastic at first. A child would cement his image as a family man, would play well with his older, more conservative business associates. But as Elena's body changed, as she grew rounder and slower and needed more rest, his patience had evaporated. "You're letting yourself go," he'd said just last week, watching her struggle to button a coat over her belly. "My mother was tiny when she was pregnant with me." It's about self-control, Elena. Self-control. As if pregnancy was something to be controlled, managed, perfected like a business deal. Diane cleared her throat, drawing Elena's attention back to the table. "Marcus was telling us about the gala next month," she said, her tone making it clear this was important. "The Commercial Real Estate Development Awards. He's being honored for the downtown project." "It's a significant achievement," Robert added, beaming at his son with obvious pride. "The youngest recipient of the award in 20 years. Elena will need something appropriate to wear," Diane continued, her eyes traveling critically over Elena's wine-stained dress. "Something that fits properly. Maybe we can help you find a designer who specializes in maternity formal wear. Someone who can make you look presentable." The words landed like small cuts, precisely targeted. "You're fat. You're poorly dressed. You're an embarrassment to our family." 3 years ago, Elena would have apologized. Would have promised to do better, to try harder, to somehow be the wife the Chens expected. 6 months ago, she would have swallowed the hurt and said nothing. Tonight, she smiled. "I'll figure something out." "Elena works at that museum," Marcus said dismissively. "She probably thinks she can wear something from their gift shop." Laughter around the table. Even Javier cracked a small smile, probably relieved the tension had shifted away from his family's inadequacies. "The museum has an excellent collection," Elena said mildly. "We recently acquired several pieces from prominent Colombian artists, including some from the estate of Cristina Vasquez." The room went quiet. Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd just lied. The museum hadn't acquired anything from her grandmother's estate because, as far as Elena had known until 10 minutes ago, there hadn't been an estate. But something in her gut told her this lie was important. This lie was a test. "Cristina Vasquez," Diane repeated slowly. "That was your grandmother's name, wasn't it?" "Yes," Elena said. "I didn't realize the museum had acquired pieces from her estate until recently." Apparently there was some confusion about the holdings. Marcus was staring at her now, his expression unreadable. "Your grandmother was a seamstress. What would museums want from her estate?" "People are complicated," Elena said softly, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the wine incident. "Sometimes they're more than what they appear to be on the surface." The moment stretched between them, loaded with meaning neither of them fully understood yet. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing something had shifted but unable to pinpoint exactly what. "Well," Patricia interjected nervously, clearly desperate to diffuse whatever tension was building, "that's wonderful, Mija. Your abuela would have been so proud." The servers returned with dessert, some elaborate French pastry that Diane had special ordered from a bakery in Beverly Hills. Elena accepted her plate mechanically, her mind racing. 4-year waiting period. Substantial holdings. Estate attorneys in New York. What had Cristina been hiding? And why had she waited 4 years before allowing Elena access to whatever inheritance she'd left? Elena thought back to the last time she'd seen her grandmother alive. It had been a rushed visit, just before the wedding. Cristina had been in the hospital, her heart finally failing after years of warnings from doctors she'd mostly ignored. She'd gripped Elena's hand with surprising strength, her dark eyes fierce despite the oxygen tube and monitors. "Mi amor," she'd whispered in Spanish, "promise me something. Anything, abuela. Don't lose yourself. Don't forget where you come from. Don't let anyone make you small." Cristina's grip had tightened. "And if you ever need help, if you ever need to remember who you are, call Robert Morrison in New York. He has something for you. Something I've been saving." At the time, Elena had assumed she meant some small keepsake, maybe a piece of jewelry or family photos. She'd been so focused on the wedding, on becoming Mrs. Marcus Chen, on starting her new life, that she'd never followed up. Had never called anyone named Robert Morrison. Had let the promise slip away in the chaos of marriage and moving and trying to become the perfect wife. Now that promise echoed in her mind like a bell. "Elena?" Sophia's voice cut through her thoughts. "Are you okay? You're crying." Elena touched her face, surprised to find tears on her cheeks. "Just hormones," she said quickly, wiping them away. "The baby makes me emotional." But they weren't pregnancy hormones making her cry. They were 3 years of swallowed anger and accumulated hurt and the sudden, overwhelming relief of a door opening when she thought she was trapped in a room with no exits. Marcus pushed back from the table, checking his Rolex. "I have an early meeting tomorrow," he announced. "Elena, we should go." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, issued with the casual authority of someone who'd never been disobeyed. Elena stood slowly, her movements deliberate. "I'm actually going to stay and help clean up," she said. "Sophia can give me a ride home later." Marcus's expression darkened. "I said we're leaving." "And I said I'm staying." Elena's voice remained calm, but something in her tone made everyone at the table freeze. "I'd like to spend some time with my family." "You can go ahead." For a moment, Marcus looked genuinely shocked. In 3 years of marriage, Elena had never contradicted him directly, never challenged his decisions, never chosen her own desires over his convenience. "Elena, I'll be home before midnight," she interrupted gently. "We can talk then." The word talk hung in the air like a threat. Marcus's jaw clenched, his hands fisting at his sides. Elena could see him calculating whether to make a scene, whether to assert his authority more forcefully, whether the social cost of dragging his pregnant wife out of his parents' home was worth it. Robert Chen solved the dilemma. "Let her stay, son," he said mildly. "Women need their family time. Besides, you do have that early meeting with the contractors." Marcus nodded stiffly. He crossed to Elena, and for a moment she thought he might apologize, might acknowledge what he'd done with the wine, might show some shred of the man she'd married. Instead, he leaned down and whispered in her ear, his breath hot against her skin, "We'll discuss your behavior when you get home." Then he straightened, kissed his mother's cheek, shook his father's hand, and walked out without looking back. The room exhaled collectively after the front door closed behind him. Diane immediately stood, smoothing her designer dress. "Well, that was interesting," she said, her tone suggesting Elena had committed some terrible social transgression. "Robert, I'm tired. Let's retire." The Chens departed to their private wing of the mansion, leaving Elena alone with her family and the ruins of the dinner party. Sophia was out of her chair and hugging Elena before Diane's footsteps had faded. "Oh my God, Lena," she whispered fiercely. "I can't believe you just did that. I can't believe you stood up to him." Patricia and Javier approached more slowly, their faces reflecting a complicated mixture of pride, worry, and something that looked almost like fear. "Mija," Javier said heavily, "you know he won't forget this. Men like Marcus Chen, they don't forgive being challenged. Especially not in front of others." "I know, Papa." Elena pulled back from Sophia's embrace, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had been sustaining her was fading, leaving her shaky and overwhelmed. "You should be careful," Patricia added, wringing her hands. "A wife should, Mama, pour favor." Elena held up a hand. "I love you, but I can't hear about what a wife should do right now. Not tonight." Patricia fell silent, hurt flickering across her face. But Javier nodded slowly, his weathered hand coming to rest on Elena's shoulder. "Your abuela," he said quietly, "would be proud of you tonight." The words broke something in Elena's chest. She collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing, for the grandmother she'd lost, for the marriage that was crumbling, for the daughter growing inside her who deserved better than a father who poured wine on her mother's head. Sophia rubbed her back while Javier held her, murmuring reassurances in Spanish. Patricia hovered nearby, clearly wanting to help but uncertain how to bridge the distance that had grown between them over the years. When the tears finally subsided, Elena pulled back and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I got a message tonight. From a lawyer in New York. About Abuela's estate." 3 faces stared at her with identical expressions of confusion. "What estate?" Patricia asked. "Mama didn't have anything. Just that little apartment, and that went back to the landlord after she died." "That's what I thought too." Elena pulled out her phone and showed them the message from Robert Morrison. "But apparently there's been a 4-year waiting period. And he says there are substantial holdings." Javier's eyes widened as he read the message. Sophia grabbed the phone, her young face lighting up with excitement. "Holy shit, Lena. Your grandmother was secretly rich?" "Sophia, language," Patricia said automatically, but her attention was fixed on the phone screen. "I don't know what she was," Elena admitted. "But I'm going to find out tomorrow." "You'll need to go to New York," Javier said slowly, his business mind already working through logistics. "How soon can you travel?" "The baby, I can fly until 36 weeks. I have time." Elena pressed a hand to her belly, feeling her daughter's reassuring movement. "I need to do this before she's born. I need to understand who Abuela really was." "Does Marcus know about this?" Patricia asked, worry creasing her forehead. "No. And I'm not going to tell him until I know what I'm dealing with." Elena met her mother's eyes. "Mama, did Abuela ever talk about her life before she came to New York? About Colombia, about her family there?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "She didn't like to talk about the past," she finally said. "I always assumed it was too painful. She'd lost so much. Your grandfather died before I was born, and she'd left everything behind in Colombia. But now you're wondering if there was more to the story," Javier finished. They stood in the Chen's opulent dining room, the remains of the disastrous dinner surrounding them, and contemplated the mystery of Cristina Vasquez. A seamstress from Queens who apparently had enough wealth to require estate attorneys and 4-year waiting periods and messages about life-changing revelations. "I need to go home," Elena said finally. "Before Marcus gets even angrier." "You're not going home tonight," Sophia said firmly. "You're coming to my apartment. Let him cool off." "Sophia, Lena, he poured wine on your head. In front of everyone. You don't owe him anything right now, least of all your presence." Elena wanted to argue, but the thought of facing Marcus tonight, of enduring whatever punishment he devised for her rebellion, made her feel sick. "Just for tonight," she agreed. "I'll deal with him tomorrow." They gathered Elena's things, her purse, her coat, her dignity piece by piece. The house staff, who'd witnessed everything, carefully avoided eye contact as the Rodriguez family made their way to the front door. Outside, the Los Angeles night was cool and clear, stars hidden by light pollution but the moon bright and full overhead. Sophia's beat-up Honda looked out of place in the circular driveway next to the Chen's fleet of luxury vehicles, but to Elena it looked like freedom. "I'll come by tomorrow," Patricia promised, kissing Elena's cheek. "We'll figure this out together, Mija." Javier pulled her into another hug, his voice gruff with emotion. "You're stronger than you know, Hija. You always have been." Elena climbed into Sophia's passenger seat, the vinyl still warm from the earlier sunshine. As they pulled away from the mansion, she looked back to see her parents standing in the driveway, their arms around each other, watching their daughter drive away from her marriage. "So," Sophia said as they merged onto the freeway, "should we talk about how you're possibly the secret heiress to some massive fortune?" Despite everything, Elena laughed. "It's probably nothing. Maybe Abuela had some savings we didn't know about. Maybe there's a small insurance policy." "Maybe," Sophia agreed. "Or maybe your grandmother was actually a Colombian drug lord who was in witness protection." "Sophia. I'm just saying, it would explain a lot. The secrecy, the sudden appearance of estate lawyers, the 4-year waiting period. Abuela was not a drug lord." "Are you sure?" Because I'm pretty sure drug lords look exactly like tiny old ladies who make empanadas and watch telenovelas. They were both giggling now, the tension of the evening releasing in waves of borderline hysterical laughter. Elena's stomach hurt, her face ached, but she couldn't stop. It felt good to laugh. It felt good to breathe. Sophia's apartment was in Koreatown, a small one-bedroom on the third floor of a building that had seen better days. It was everything the Chen mansion wasn't: cramped, slightly shabby, filled with mismatched furniture and Sophia's collection of vintage concert posters. It was also warm and lived in and completely free of judgment. "You can have my bed," Sophia said, already pulling out sheets. "I'll take the couch." "Sophia, you don't have to, you're 6 months pregnant and you've had a traumatic evening. You're taking the bed." Sophia's tone brooked no argument. Elena borrowed one of Sophia's oversized t-shirts and stood under the shower spray until the last traces of wine washed from her hair. She watched the pink-tinged water swirl down the drain and imagined she was washing away more than just Bordeaux. 3 years of diminishing herself. 3 years of accepting treatment she never should have tolerated. 3 years of forgetting who Elena Vasquez was beneath the performance of being Mrs. Marcus Chen. When she finally emerged, Sophia had made tea and was sitting cross-legged on the couch with her laptop open. "I've been Googling your grandmother," she announced. "There's not much. A few mentions in immigration records from the 1970s, an address in Queens, but then I found something interesting." Elena sat down beside her, mug warming her hands. "What?" Sophia turned the laptop so Elena could see the screen. It was an old newspaper article from 1973, scanned and archived in a digital library. The headline read, "Colombian business family relocates to New York." The photo was grainy and old, but Elena recognized her grandmother immediately. Christina, probably in her late 30s, standing beside a tall man Elena had never seen before. And in the text, Christina and Eduardo Vasquez, formerly of Bogotá, have relocated their textile business to New York City. The Vasquez family owned one of Colombia's largest fabric manufacturing operations before political instability forced them to seek opportunities abroad. They plan to continue the family business in their new home. Elena stared at the article, her mind reeling. Textile business? Political instability? "Keep reading," Sophia urged. Elena scrolled down. The article went on to mention that the Vasquez family had been prominent in Colombian industry for 3 generations, that they'd owned factories and warehouses and had contracts with major clothing designers. That they'd left Colombia with significant assets during a period of unrest in the early 1970s. "There's more," Sophia said, clicking to another tab. This one was a property record from 1975. "Look at this. Your grandmother and grandfather bought a warehouse in Queens. Commercial property, right on the water. They registered a business called Vasquez Textiles Incorporated, but Abuela worked as a seamstress," Elena protested weakly. "She had that little sewing shop in the apartment. She made dresses for the neighborhood women. Maybe that's what she wanted people to see." Sophia pulled up more documents, business registrations, property transfers, corporate filings. A pattern emerged of the Vasquez family quietly acquiring real estate, registering businesses, building something substantial while maintaining the appearance of being just another immigrant family scraping by. "After your grandfather died," Sophia clicked to a death certificate from 1982, "it looks like Christina transferred everything into trusts. Multiple trusts with different names. She basically made the assets invisible." "Why?" Elena felt like she was learning about a stranger, not the grandmother who'd taught her to make tamales and held her when she cried over bad test grades. "Why hide everything? Protection, maybe? If she came from wealth in Colombia and fled during political instability, maybe she didn't want to be a target. Or maybe," Sophia's eyes lit up with a new theory, "maybe she was protecting it for you. Making sure that if you married some asshole who would pour wine on your head, he wouldn't be able to touch your inheritance." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility. Elena's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Where are you?" She typed back, "At Sophia's." I'll be home tomorrow. His response was immediate. We need to talk about your disrespect tonight. Elena stared at the words. Your disrespect. Not his behavior. Not the wine. Not the humiliation. Her disrespect. She turned off her phone. Good, Sophia said approvingly. Let him stew. They stayed up late into the night, searching for information about Cristina Vasquez. They found property records, business registrations, decades of careful financial management that told the story of a woman who'd built an empire in the shadows. By the time Elena finally crawled into Sophia's bed, her mind was spinning with questions and possibilities and the dawning realization that her grandmother had left her something far more valuable than money. She'd left her power. The power to choose. The power to walk away. The power to never let anyone pour wine on her head again. Morning came with sharp sunlight through Sophia's blinds and the sound of her phone buzzing insistently from the nightstand. Elena rolled over, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward, and grabbed the phone. 7 missed calls from Marcus. 3 from Diane. 1 from the museum asking if she was coming in today. And 1 new voicemail from a New York number. Elena sat up, suddenly completely awake. She hit play on the voicemail, her heart hammering. Ms. Vasquez, this is Robert Morrison returning your inquiry from last night. I'm pleased to hear from you after all this time. Your grandmother was very specific about when and how you should learn about your inheritance. The 4-year waiting period was her idea. She said you'd need time to know yourself, to make your own choices, to be ready for what she wanted to give you. I have extensive documentation here regarding the Vasquez family holdings. I'd like to arrange a meeting as soon as possible. There are time-sensitive matters that require your attention, particularly regarding properties and businesses that have been held in trust. Please call me at your earliest convenience. And Ms. Vasquez? Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman. What she built for you, what she protected for you, it's remarkable. I think you'll be very proud. The voicemail ended. Elena sat in Sophia's rumpled bed, her hand on her belly, and felt the full weight of what her grandmother had done. 4 years. Cristina had known that Elena needed 4 years to understand what her marriage really was. 4 years to grow from a naive 25-year-old bride into a woman who could handle power and wealth without being corrupted by it. 4 years to learn who Marcus Chen really was beneath the charm and success. Her grandmother had known. Somehow, from her hospital bed, weak and dying, Cristina had known exactly what Elena needed and when she'd need it. I have to go to New York, Elena said aloud. Sophia appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her work clothes. She managed a small art gallery in Silver Lake. When? Today, if I can get a flight. I'm coming with you. Sophia, you have work, my boss loves me and I have vacation days saved up. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get distracted by your secret fortune and forget to come home. Sophia grinned. I'm thinking of this as a girl's trip. A totally normal girl's trip where we find out your grandmother was secretly the Colombian textile queen. By noon, they were at LAX with 2 hastily packed bags and tickets on the 3 p.m. flight to JFK. Elena had called the museum to request emergency family leave. She'd called Robert Morrison to schedule a meeting for first thing tomorrow morning. She'd left a single text from Marcus, family emergency. Gone to New York. We'll be back in a few days. His response had been predictably angry, but Elena had stopped reading after the first line. Whatever he had to say could wait. Whatever punishment he planned for her rebellion could wait. Right now, she needed to meet the grandmother she'd never really known. The flight was long and uncomfortable. Elena's belly made it impossible to get comfortable in the cramped economy seat, and her mind wouldn't stop racing through possibilities. What if her grandmother had left her a warehouse? A small business? What if there was nothing at all, and the lawyer was mistaken? But she kept thinking about that newspaper article. About Cristina standing beside Eduardo, both of them dressed in business clothes, looking prosperous and confident. About the property records Sophia had found. About decades of careful planning and invisible wealth building. They landed at JFK after midnight New York time, both exhausted. The hotel was modest, Elena had insisted, despite Sophia's protests that if they were about to discover a fortune, they should stay somewhere nice. Old habits of frugality died hard. Elena fell asleep almost immediately, her daughter kicking gently against her ribs, and dreamed of her grandmother. In the dream, Christina was young and powerful, standing in a factory surrounded by bolts of fabric in every color imaginable. She turned to Elena and smiled. "Don't forget who you are," Dream Christina said. "You're a Vasquez. We don't break. We build." The offices of Morrison and Associates occupied the 20th floor of a building in Midtown, all glass and steel and the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 50s, smiled warmly when Elena gave her name. "Ms. Vasquez, Mr. Morrison has been expecting you. He's cleared his entire morning." She stood and gestured toward a hallway. "Right this way." Robert Morrison was in his mid-60s, with silver hair and the kind of face that inspired trust. His office was lined with law books and family photos, and he rose from behind his desk with obvious pleasure when Elena entered. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "I can't tell you how happy I am to finally meet you. Your grandmother spoke of you constantly. She was so proud of you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't understand any of this. I thought my grandmother was just an old seamstress in Queens." Robert smiled gently. "That's exactly what she wanted people to think. Please, sit down. This is going to take a while." Sophia sat beside Elena, her phone out to record notes. Robert didn't object. "Your grandmother," he began, "was one of the most remarkable women I've ever met. When she came to me in 1990, she had a very specific goal, to protect her family's wealth and ensure it would pass to you under the right circumstances." He opened a folder, spreading documents across his desk. Cristina and Eduardo Vasquez left Colombia in 1973 as political refugees. But before they left, they liquidated their textile empire, factories, warehouses, equipment, everything. They converted it all to cash and assets they could transport. "How much?" Elena whispered. "In 1973? Approximately $20 million. Which they invested very carefully over the next 40 years. The room seemed to spin. Elena gripped the arms of her chair, feeling Sophia's hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Robert continued, his voice matter-of-fact. "Your grandmother was brilliant with investments. She bought commercial real estate all over New York and New Jersey when prices were low in the 80s. She invested in tech companies in the 90s before most people understood the internet. She diversified into international markets, into bonds, into carefully selected stocks." He pulled out a document, setting it in front of Elena. "As of this morning, the Vasquez Family Trust, of which you are the sole beneficiary, is valued at approximately $2.8 billion. The words didn't make sense. Elena stared at the numbers on the page, at the decimal point that couldn't possibly be in the right place. That can't be right." "It is right." Robert's voice was gentle but firm. "Your grandmother spent 40 years building this for you. She lived in that small apartment in Queens, worked as a seamstress, sent money to family in Colombia, all while managing a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She wanted you to grow up normal. To understand the value of work, of community, of staying connected to your roots. She didn't want wealth to corrupt you or isolate you or change who you fundamentally were." "But why now?" Elena could barely get the words out. "Why wait 4 years after she died?" "Because your grandmother was wise." Robert leaned back in his chair. "She knew you'd met Marcus Chen. She knew you were planning to marry him. And she was worried." "About Marcus?" "About whether you'd be able to distinguish between someone who loved you and someone who loved your potential wealth. She said you needed time to see your marriage clearly, without the complication of money. If your marriage lasted 4 years and was happy, truly happy, then the wealth could be a blessing you shared. But if it was difficult, if you were unhappy, if your husband showed his true colors. Robert paused meaningfully. Then the inheritance would be your escape route. Elena started crying then, really crying, deep sobs that shook her whole body. Sophia wrapped her arms around her while Robert quietly pushed a box of tissues across the desk. She knew, Elena gasped between sobs. She knew I'd need this. She knew you were strong enough to survive without it, Robert corrected gently. But she wanted to make sure you'd never have to. When Elena finally composed herself, Robert walked her through the details. The trust was complex, with multiple layers of protection. It held commercial properties in 5 states, stock portfolios managed by 3 different firms, bonds, investments in private companies, even a significant stake in a fashion house that had been built using Vasquez textile designs from the 70s. There's also this, Robert said, pulling out a sealed envelope. Your grandmother left you a letter. She made me promise to give it to you after I'd explained everything else. Elena took the envelope with shaking hands. Her name was written on the front in Christina's elegant cursive. She opened it carefully, aware that Sophia and Robert were watching. The letter was in Spanish, dated just days before Christina's death. Mi querida Elena, if you're reading this, then 4 years have passed and you know the truth. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I'm sorry I let you think I was just a simple woman with a simple life. But I hope you understand why. I came to this country with your grandfather because we had no choice. The Colombia we knew was being torn apart, and staying would have cost us our lives. We brought what we could, rebuilt what we'd lost, and I spent 40 years making sure our family would never be vulnerable again. But money changes people, mi amor. I've seen it happen. Good people become greedy. Kind people become cruel. I didn't want that for you. I wanted you to know who you were without wealth to distort your reflection. I wanted you to understand struggle, to value work, to stay connected to where you came from. These 4 years were a test, but not of you. They were a test of the man you married. If he loved you truly, if he treated you with respect and kindness, then you could share this inheritance and build something beautiful together. But if he showed you who he really was, if he was cruel, controlling, if he made you feel small, then this wealth would be your freedom. You are a Vasquez woman, Elena. We don't break. We bend, we endure, but we don't break. And when we rise completely. I've left you enough money that you never have to depend on anyone. Enough that you can make choices based on what's right, not what's convenient. Enough that our family's legacy continues through you and your children. Use it wisely. Use it well. And never, ever, let anyone pour wine on your head. I love you forever, Abuela Elena. Read the last line 3 times. Never let anyone pour wine on your head. Christina couldn't have known. It was impossible. And yet. She knew, Elena whispered. She knew exactly what kind of man he was. Sophia grabbed the letter, read it quickly, and let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Your grandmother was magic. There's no other explanation. Robert smiled knowingly. Your grandmother was very perceptive. She told me once that she could see cruelty in people the way others see colors. She said Marcus Chen had eyes like ice. She didn't want you trapped with him. They spent the next 3 hours going through paperwork. Elena signed documents, received access to bank accounts, learned about properties she now owns scattered across multiple states. The lawyer explained about the management companies that had been overseeing everything, about the financial advisors who'd been growing her wealth, about the layers of protection Christina had built to ensure no one could challenge Elena's ownership. There's one more thing, Robert said as they were preparing to leave. Your grandmother left specific instructions about this. She wanted you to know that you own 42% of Chen Development through a shell corporation that was established in 2019. Elena froze. What? Chen Development. Your husband's company. Your grandmother began acquiring shares through various investment vehicles 3 years ago. She knew he was using company funds inappropriately and wanted to ensure you have leverage if you ever needed it. The implications crashed over Elena like a wave. Marcus's company. The source of all his pride and arrogance. His proof that he was a self-made man who'd built an empire. She owned almost half of it. He has no idea, Elena said slowly. None whatsoever. The shares are held through multiple LLCs and investment groups. There's no way to trace them back to you without extensive forensic accounting. Which means, Robert's smile was decidedly satisfied, you have options, Ms. Vasquez. A great many options. Elena stood on shaking legs, Sophia supporting her elbow. I need to think. I need time to process all of this. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Ms. Vasquez? Robert's voice stopped her at the door. Your husband is being honored at a gala next week. The Commercial Real Estate Development Awards. He's receiving recognition for that downtown project. I know. His mother has been hounding me about finding an appropriate dress. Robert's eyes twinkled. I suggest you find something spectacular. Because I think next week would be an excellent time for Mr. Chen to learn exactly who he married. They left Morrison and Associates in a daze. On the sidewalk outside, with New York City rushing past them in a blur of noise and motion, Sophia turned to Elena with an expression of pure awe. You're a billionaire. I can't be. You are. You're a literal billionaire. Your grandmother left you too. $8 billion. Sophia grabbed Elena's shoulders. Do you understand what this means? Do you understand what you can do? Elena pressed a hand to her belly, feeling her daughter's movements. I can leave him. You can destroy him, Sophia corrected. You can take his company apart piece by piece. You can expose every shady thing he's ever done. I can protect my daughter, Elena interrupted quietly. I can make sure she grows up knowing her mother is strong. That she never has to accept cruelty. That she has choices. They walked through Midtown in silence for several blocks, Elena's mind spinning with possibilities. She had $8 billion. She owned nearly half of Marcus's company. She had the power to ruin him or save him, to reveal everything or walk away quietly. Her grandmother had known exactly what she was doing. She'd given Elena not just money, but choice. The freedom to decide her own fate. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Marcus. Where are you? Why aren't you answering? Your behavior is unacceptable. Elena stared at the message, then pulled up her contacts. Robert Morrison had given her his personal number with instructions to call any time. She dialed. Ms. Vasquez, he answered immediately. Is everything all right? The gala next week. The one where Marcus is being honored. Yes? I want to be there. And I want to make an announcement. She could hear the smile in Robert's voice. What kind of announcement? The kind that changes everything. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Elena flew back to Los Angeles on a private jet. She owned it, Robert had explained, part of a fractional ownership program Christina had invested in years ago. Marcus was waiting at their house in Manhattan Beach when she arrived, his anger barely contained. Where the hell have you been? He'd been drinking, Elena realized. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled. You disappeared for 3 days. Do you have any idea how that looks? Family emergency, Elena said calmly, setting down her bags. I told you. What family emergency? Your sister looked fine at dinner. It was about my grandmother's estate. Marcus's expression shifted to interest. Oh? Did she leave you something? Finally some good news from that side of your family. She left me a few things. Nothing significant. The lie came easily. Some personal items, a small amount of money. How small? Marcus, does it matter? Of course it matters. Every asset affects our financial situation. You should have discussed it with me before making the trip. He moved closer, backing her against the wall. And you should have discussed it with me before embarrassing me at my parents' house. You poured wine on my head in front of my family. You undermined me in front of mine. You questioned my business decisions. You made me look weak. His face was inches from hers now, his breath hot and sour. Do you have any idea what my father said to me after you left? Do you know how humiliating it was? Elena felt her daughter kick hard against her ribs, as if sensing the tension. She placed both hands on her belly protectively. I'm sorry you were embarrassed, she said carefully. But I'm not sorry for having opinions. Your opinions don't matter, Elena. Not when it comes to my business. Not when it comes to decisions that affect our future. Marcus pushed away from the wall, pacing. You're my wife. Your job is to support me, to make me look good, to help me succeed. Not to question me in front of potential investors and business partners. Is that what you think marriage is? Me existing to make you look good? That's what marriage is when you marry someone successful. Someone with ambitions beyond working in a museum for $40,000 a year. His tone was withering. You should be grateful I chose you, Elena. You came from nothing. Your parents barely speak English. Your grandmother was a seamstress who died in a rent-controlled apartment. I gave you status, security, a place in society. And this is how you repay me? Something crystallized in Elena's chest. Marcus had always been subtly condescending about her background, but he'd never been quite this explicit about viewing her as a charity case. As someone who should be perpetually grateful for his attention. You're right, she said quietly. I did come from nothing. And I am grateful. Marcus blinked, clearly surprised by her capitulation. Good. Then you understand why your behavior needs to change. I do. I understand completely. Elena met his eyes directly. I'll be at the gala next week. I'll wear something appropriate. And I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who I am and where I come from. That's better. Marcus's posture relaxed. My mother has an appointment scheduled for you with her personal shopper. Something elegant but not attention-grabbing. We want people focused on my award, not on you. Of course. He moved toward their bedroom, then paused. And Elena? If you ever disappear like that again without my permission, there will be consequences. I'm your husband. You don't get to just leave. Understood. After he'd gone upstairs, Elena sank into the couch, her hands shaking. Permission. He'd actually said she needed his permission to travel. As if she were a child or a possession rather than a partner. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. How did it go? Elena typed back, he has no idea what's coming. The next morning, Elena canceled the appointment with Diane's personal shopper and instead took Sophia to Rodeo Drive. They ended up at a designer boutique where Elena had never shopped before. She'd always been too intimidated by the prices, too conscious of her budget, too aware that she didn't belong in stores where dresses cost more than her monthly salary. But she belonged now, didn't she? She had $2.8 billion. She could buy the entire store if she wanted to. I need something for a gala, she told the consultant who appeared at her elbow. Something that says I'm powerful and I know exactly who I am. The consultant's eyes lit up. I have just the thing. An hour later, Elena stood in front of a three-way mirror wearing a dress that made her breath catch. Deep emerald green silk that draped over her pregnant curves like liquid jewelry. Off-shoulder design that showcased her collarbones and the diamond necklace Sophia had insisted she buy. The color made her skin glow, made her dark eyes luminous, made her look like someone who could command a room full of wealthy developers and make them listen. That's the one, Sophia breathed. Holy shit, Lena. You look like a queen. I look like someone who owns 42% of her husband's company, Elena corrected with a smile. The dress cost $18,000. Elena didn't blink at the price. Over the next few days, she made careful preparations. She met with Robert Morrison via video call, going over the exact wording of what she planned to say. She consulted with financial advisors about the best way to restructure Chen Development once her ownership became public knowledge. She spoke with lawyers about divorce proceedings and custody arrangements and restraining orders if necessary. And she avoided Marcus as much as possible. He was too busy preparing for the gala anyway, too focused on his acceptance speech and networking opportunities to pay much attention to his pregnant wife. He assumed she'd learned her lesson. That she'd been properly cowed by his anger and threats. He had no idea she was sharpening her knives. The night before the gala, Elena sat in their bedroom, soon to be just his bedroom, she thought with satisfaction, and drafted a list of properties she'd need to move out. Her clothes and personal items were minimal. The baby furniture could be replaced. She didn't want anything that belonged to this house, this life, this version of herself that had let a man pour wine on her head. Her phone rang. Her mother. "Mija," Patricia said without preamble, "Sophia told me what you're planning. Are you sure about this?" "More sure than I've ever been about anything. Your father and we worried about your marriage. We could see how Marcus treated you. But we didn't know how to say anything without making you feel like we disapproved. You should have said something, Mama. Would you have listened?" Patricia asked gently. "You loved him. You thought he'd change. We all want to believe the people we love will become better versions of themselves." Elena felt tears threaten. "Did you know about Abuela? About what she'd done?" "No. Mama kept her secrets close. But I'm not surprised she protected you. That's what the women in our family do. We protect each other." Patricia's voice grew stronger. "Tomorrow, when you stand up and tell the truth, know that your father and I are proud of you. So proud. You're stronger than I ever was. You're strong, Mama. You've stayed with Papa for 30 years. That's not strength, Mija. That's fear. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear of disappointing people. Patricia paused, emotion thick in her voice, "You're about to do something I never had the courage to do. And your daughter is going to grow up knowing her mother doesn't accept cruelty. That's worth everything." After they hung up, Elena lay in bed listening to Marcus snore beside her and thought about generations of women. Her grandmother fleeing Colombia with a fortune hidden in suitcases and offshore accounts. Her mother staying in a marriage that never quite fit, afraid to ask for more. Elena herself, spending 3 years making herself smaller to fit into Marcus Chen's vision of the perfect wife. But that ended tomorrow. Tomorrow, Elena Vasquez Chen would show the world exactly who she'd been all along. The Beverly Hilton ballroom glittered with 500 of Los Angeles's wealthiest real estate developers, investors, and businesspeople. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, each table decorated with elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than Elena used to make in a month. Waiters circulated with champagne and canapes, and everywhere Elena looked, she saw expensive suits, designer dresses, the casual display of wealth that used to make her feel inadequate. Now it just made her smile. She stood near the entrance with Sophia, both of them deliberately arriving fashionably late. Elena's emerald dress drew immediate attention, multiple heads turning to stare at the pregnant woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Her hair was up in an elegant twist, diamond earrings catching the light. She looked expensive. Powerful. Nothing like the uncertain woman Marcus had poured wine on a week ago. "Ready?" Sophia asked, squeezing her sister's hand. "Ready." They swept into the ballroom together. Elena spotted Marcus immediately. He was at a table near the front with his parents, clearly positioned for maximum visibility when he accepted his award. She saw the moment he noticed her, saw his eyes widen as he took in the dress, the jewelry, the way she held herself with absolute confidence. Diane Chen's mouth fell open. Robert Chen's expression shifted from surprise to something like respect. Elena walked directly to their table, Sophia at her side, aware that conversations were stopping all around them as people noticed the drama unfolding. "Marcus," she said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not late. Where did you get that dress?" Diane hissed. "That's not what my shopper would have chosen. I chose it myself. Do you like it?" Elena did a small turn, the silk flowing around her like water. It's inappropriate, Diane managed. Too flashy. You're supposed to be supporting Marcus, not drawing attention to yourself. Don't worry. Marcus is about to get plenty of attention. Elena took a seat at the table, smiling at the other guests who were watching with obvious fascination. I'm Elena, by the way. Marcus's wife. The one he poured wine on last week. Stunned silence at the table. Marcus's face went red, then white. Elena, what are you doing? I'm being myself, Marcus. Isn't that what you always wanted? Before he could respond, the lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the stage where the evening's host, a well-known television personality who moonlighted at charity events, was preparing to speak. The awards ceremony began. Elena sat through presentations honoring various developers for affordable housing initiatives, historic preservation, sustainable building practices. Everyone she knew quietly that most of these awards were more about public relations than actual achievement, but the real estate industry loved celebrating itself. Finally, the host announced, and now, the Young Developer of the Year award. This honor recognizes exceptional achievement by a developer under 40 who has demonstrated vision, business acumen, and significant contribution to Los Angeles's commercial landscape. This year's recipient has transformed downtown real estate through innovative mixed-use developments. Please welcome Marcus Chen. Applause filled the ballroom as Marcus stood, buttoning his tuxedo jacket with the practiced movements of someone comfortable in the spotlight. He walked to the stage, shook hands with the host, and accepted a crystal trophy that probably cost more to make than to earn. Thank you, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. This award represents years of hard work, dedication, and vision. When I founded Chen Development 5 years ago, I had nothing but a business plan and determination. Today, we're one of the fastest growing development firms in Los Angeles, with projects worth over $200 million. He went on, talking about his vision for the city, his commitment to excellence, his plans for expansion. He mentioned his parents, his mentors, his business partners. He did not mention Elena. When he finished, the audience applauded politely. Marcus returned to his seat, trophy in hand, beaming with satisfaction. The host returned to the microphone. Thank you, Marcus. And now, we have a surprise addition to tonight's program. Elena Vasquez-Chen has requested a moment to speak. Elena? Elena saw Marcus's head snap toward the stage, saw the confusion and then dawning horror on his face as she rose from her seat and walked toward the spotlight. She took the microphone from the host's hand, smiled at the sea of faces watching her, and felt her daughter kick hard against her ribs. Courage, the kick seemed to say. You've got this. Good evening, Elena began, her voice steady. I'm Elena Vasquez-Chen, though most of you know me as Marcus's wife. The one who's usually in the background at these events, smiling and looking supportive. But tonight, I wanted to introduce myself properly. She paused, letting the tension build. I'm the granddaughter of Cristina Maria Vasquez, who came to this country in 1973 as a refugee from Colombia. Most people knew her as a seamstress who lived in a small apartment in Queens. But what most people didn't know is that my grandmother came from one of Colombia's most prominent textile manufacturing families. She and my grandfather fled political instability with significant assets, which they very carefully invested over the next 40 years. Elena could see the confusion spreading through the audience. Marcus was half standing at his table, his face contorted with shock. 4 years ago, my grandmother died. But she left instructions that I wasn't to learn about my inheritance until now. She wanted to make sure I knew who I was without wealth defining me. She wanted me to understand the value of work, of community, of building something meaningful. Elena's voice grew stronger. She was right to wait. Because in these 4 years, I've learned exactly what kind of person I married. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Last week, at a family dinner, I asked my husband a question about his development plans. Specifically, I asked what would happen to the low-income tenants in the buildings he plans to demolish. My husband's response was to pour a $300 bottle of wine over my head in front of our families. While I was 6 months pregnant with his daughter. The room erupted. People were standing, pointing, phones coming out to capture the moment. Marcus looked like he might be sick. I tell you this not for sympathy, but for context. Because tonight, I'd like to make an announcement. As of this morning, I am the majority shareholder of Chen Development. Through various holding companies and LLCs established by my grandmother, I own 42% of the company my husband just claimed to have built from nothing. The ballroom exploded with noise. Marcus collapsed back into his chair, the trophy slipping from his hands and shattering on the marble floor. Diane was clutching her chest. Robert's face had gone completely blank with shock. Elena continued over the chaos, her voice cutting through. As majority shareholder, I'll be implementing immediate changes to Chen Development's business practices. Starting with a complete review of the downtown project. Those buildings Marcus plans to demolish? They're staying. We'll renovate them into truly affordable mixed-income housing. The tenants who live there now won't be displaced. They'll be partners in our revitalization plan. She saw Robert Morrison standing at a table near the back, grinning like a proud father. Furthermore, I'll be establishing the Cristina Vasquez Foundation, dedicated to preserving affordable housing and supporting immigrant communities. We'll be starting with a $100 million endowment, and we'll be working with communities, not against them, to build the kind of city my grandmother would have been proud of. Elena set the microphone back in its stand. Thank you for your time. And Marcus? I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning. You'll be hearing from my attorneys about the custody arrangements for our daughter. I'm sure they'll be very fair. Much fairer than you were when you poured wine on my head. She walked off the stage into complete pandemonium. Sophia was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, laughing and crying simultaneously. They pushed through the crowd toward the exit, ignoring the reporters and photographers who were suddenly very interested in Elena Vasquez Chen. Behind them, Elena heard Marcus's voice raised in something like a scream. She didn't look back. Outside the ballroom, in the hotel's quiet lobby, Elena finally allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding her system, but she felt lighter than she had in 3 years. That, Sophia said reverently, was the most badass thing I have ever witnessed. Your grandmother would be so proud, Robert Morrison said, appearing from a side hallway. That was perfection, Ms. Vasquez. Absolute perfection. What happens now? Elena asked. Now? Now you go home, not to Marcus's house. I've already arranged for movers to transfer your belongings to a property you own in Santa Monica. Now you prepare to welcome your daughter into a world where she knows her mother is strong. And now, Robert's smile was triumphant, now you build the empire your grandmother always knew you were capable of building. Elena's phone started buzzing with messages. Sophia showed her the screen. Elena's announcement was already trending on social media, the video of her speech going viral, headlines forming, real estate developer's wife reveals secret fortune and ownership of husband's company, and pregnant woman exposes husband's abuse at awards ceremony, and billionaire heiress announces affordable housing initiative. But Elena wasn't reading the headlines. She was looking at a single text from her mother, Tu abuela está mirando y sonriendo. Your grandmother is watching and smiling. We're so proud. 3 months later, Elena stood in the renovated penthouse she now called home, her newborn daughter asleep in her arms. Catalina Cristina Vasquez, named after her great-grandmother, had been born 2 weeks ago, healthy and beautiful and completely unaware that she'd been born into one of the country's wealthiest families. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Elena could see the Santa Monica coastline stretching out in both directions. The penthouse had belonged to her grandmother, purchased in the 80s and held in trust, waiting for Elena to claim it. It was modern and spacious and absolutely nothing like the house she'd shared with Marcus in Manhattan Beach. That house had sold immediately. Marcus had needed the money. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Once Elena's ownership of Chen Development became public, Marcus's entire empire had crumbled. Other business partners had started asking questions about his financial practices. Investors had pulled out. The bank had called in loans. Within a month, Chen Development had restructured completely under Elena's direction, with new leadership focused on sustainable, community-centered development. Marcus had been offered a severance package and asked to resign. He'd taken it. The last Elena heard, he'd moved to Seattle to start over, his tail between his legs, his reputation in ruins. His parents had tried to fight the divorce, had hired expensive lawyers to challenge everything. But when faced with evidence of Marcus's financial improprieties, his emotional abuse, and the fact that his wife was worth nearly $3 billion and owned the company they'd thought their son had built, the Chens had eventually accepted defeat. Elena had been generous in the settlement. She'd given Marcus enough money to restart somewhere else, to build something new. She'd even agreed to reasonable visitation with Catalina, though Marcus had only visited once. He'd held his daughter awkwardly, looking uncomfortable and resentful, and Elena had realized that he'd never wanted to be a father. He'd wanted a prop, a demonstration of his traditional family values for his business associates. Well, he'd lost his prop and his business and his reputation all in one spectacular evening. Sophia knocked on the door frame, carrying coffee and pastries. "How's our little revolutionary?" "Sleeping, finally." Elena transferred the baby carefully to her bassinet, tucking the blankets around her tiny form. "Did you see the news? About the downtown project breaking ground?" "Yes, it's beautiful." They interviewed some of the tenants who are staying in their apartments. One woman started crying, talking about how she thought she'd have to move, but now she gets to stay in her neighborhood and be part of the revitalization. Sophia set down the food and hugged her sister. "You did that, Lena. You saved people's homes." "Abuela did that," Elena corrected. "She gave me the power to make different choices." Over the past 3 months, Elena had thrown herself into learning her grandmother's business. She'd met with the financial advisors who'd been managing the Vasquez fortune, toured the properties her family owned, studied investment strategies and market trends. She'd discovered that she had a gift for it, the same gift Christina had possessed, an instinct for seeing value where others saw risk. The Christina Vasquez Foundation was already making waves. They'd purchased 3 other buildings slated for demolition and converted them to affordable housing. They'd partnered with local organizations to provide job training and small business loans. They'd funded scholarships for children of immigrants. They were building exactly the kind of legacy Christina would have wanted. And Elena was building something else too, a future for her daughter where she'd grow up knowing her worth wasn't tied to any man's approval. Where she'd understand that power could be used to protect and uplift, not just to accumulate and dominate. Where she'd learn from her great-grandmother's example that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait, plan, and strike at exactly the right moment. Elena's phone buzzed. A message from her mother: "Can we visit this weekend? Your father wants to meet his granddaughter properly. Tell him yes. And tell him to bring Abuela's recipe book. I want to make Catalina her tamales when she's old enough to eat them." That evening, after Sophia had left and the baby was sleeping peacefully, Elena sat on her balcony watching the sun set over the Pacific. She thought about the woman who'd poured wine on her head, that uncertain, diminished version of herself who'd accepted cruelty because she thought she had no other options. That woman was gone. In her place was Elena Vasquez, business mogul, philanthropist, mother, and the living embodiment of her grandmother's careful planning and fierce love. Her phone buzzed one more time. A message from an unknown number: "This is Marcus. I saw the news about the foundation. What you're doing is good. I'm sorry for everything. I hope Catalina grows up to be like you, not like me." Elena stared at the message for a long moment. Then she deleted it and blocked the number. Some apologies came too late. Some wounds couldn't be healed by words, only by actions and time and the choice to never let anyone treat you that way again. She looked down at her sleeping daughter, at the perfect tiny human who would never know a world where her mother accepted being treated as less than. Who would grow up with every advantage not just of wealth, but of legacy, of family history, of knowing she came from women who built empires in the shadows and struck like lightning when the time was right. Your bisabuela was a genius, Elena whispered to the sleeping baby. She knew exactly what I needed and exactly when I'd need it. And someday, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you the story of how she gave me the power to choose myself. To choose us. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and the city lights began to twinkle across Los Angeles. Somewhere out there, in buildings her family owned, in neighborhoods they were helping to preserve, in communities they were supporting, Cristina Vasquez's legacy continued to grow. And Elena Vasquez stood on her balcony, looked out at an empire built by women who refused to be broken, and smiled. The wine had washed away more than just her dignity that night. It had washed away every illusion, every false belief, every reason she'd given herself to stay small. Now she was exactly as large as her grandmother had always known she could be.